The grand hall of the solitary empire was silent. Tall, powerful warriors in shining armor stood on either side of the throne, their sharp eyes fixed on the small figure standing before the king. King Vorzel, ruler of the Exaltari, sat upon his massive throne, his piercing golden eyes filled with disappointment. His people were strong, fearless, and born to fight. Yet his daughter, Princess Kaleri, was none of those things. She was smaller than the others, her frame too thin, her posture too weak. She had never won a battle, never led soldiers, never proved herself, and in the solitary world, that meant she was nothing. Before her stood Commander Doran, a human warrior with a reputation as a tactical genius. He was a man of war, dressed in simple yet practical armor, his presence alone enough to command respect. He had fought against the Exaltari before, and now, through uneasy peace, he was an ally. The moment Kaleri heard her father's voice, her heart sank. "You are of no use to our people, Kaleri." The king's voice was firm, emotionless. "But perhaps, in human hands, you may find some worth." Kaleri clenched her fists, humiliation burning in her chest. She had always known she was unwanted, but to be given away like an object, that was something she never expected. The hall erupted into laughter and whispers. "The king is wise." One noble sneered, "Humans are weak too. She will fit right in. Even a human cannot turn her into a warrior." Another added. Doran said nothing for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes scanning Kaleri from head to toe. He could see the fear in her stance, the hesitation in her breath. She was nothing like the solitary warriors who had battled his forces before. Finally, he spoke. "I accept." The room fell silent again. Even Kaleri looked up in surprise. Doran turned to King Vorzel and nodded. "But on one condition. She is mine to train as I see fit. No interference from the Exaltari." The king waved his hand. "Do whatever you want with her. She is no longer my concern." Kaleri's heart pounded as she followed Doran out of the throne room. She wanted to scream, to demand that she be given a chance to prove herself to her own people. But the truth was, no one would listen. She was weak in their eyes. And so, she left her home, her world, and her past behind. The human's world. Kaleri had expected to be taken to some human city filled with comfort and luxury. But instead, she found herself in a military training camp on the harsh desert planet of Rathos 5. The air was dry and hot, the ground rough beneath her feet. Towering machines rumbled in the distance, and soldiers moved with purpose, training, shouting, and preparing for battle. Doran led her through the camp without a word. Finally, they stopped at an open training field, where several human soldiers had gathered. Kaleri could feel their eyes on her, filled with doubt and curiosity. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, smirked. "This is the alien princess." Another chuckled. "I've seen stronger recruits. She won't last a day." Kaleri's face burned with shame, but before she could say anything, Doran spoke. "She will train like everyone else." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. No special treatment. No exceptions. Kaleri turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Doran folded his arms. "You think just because you're a princess, you're different. No, you're weak, and I don't train weaklings. You want to survive. Earn it." His words hit like a strike to the chest, but Kaleri saw no hatred in his eyes. He wasn't mocking her. He was testing her, and something inside her refused to back down. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin. "Then I will train." Doran nodded, satisfied. "Then let's begin." The first trial. Kaleri's first training session was brutal. The human exercises were unlike anything she had seen. She was forced to run for miles under the scorching sun, her legs burning with exhaustion. Her body ached, her breath came in ragged gasps, and yet she was not allowed to stop. Doran watched from the sidelines, his sharp eyes judging her every move. The other recruits mocked her failures, But Kalari refused to let their words break her. When she fell, she got up. When she stumbled, she pushed forward. When her body screamed in protest, she silenced it. She was not strong, not yet, but for the first time, she realized something. She was not weak either. The air was tense in the training camp of Rathos 5. The usual sounds of drills and commands had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Something was wrong. Kalari could feel it. She stood beside the other recruits, sweat still drying on her skin from the last round of combat training. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. But Doran's face was serious, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then the alarm sounded. A loud, piercing noise echoed through the base, followed by a sharp voice over the communication system. Unidentified ships approaching. Possible Saltari rebel attack. Kalari's breath caught in her throat. Rebels. Her father's empire was powerful, but there were always those who opposed the king's rule. The rebels were Saltari warriors who believed the empire had grown weak by forming peace treaties with humans. They wanted war, and they saw Kalari as a disgrace to their species. They had come for her. The invasion begins. Doran wasted no time. He turned to the recruits, his voice calm but firm. Listen up. This is not a drill. We hold our position and defend the camp. If they break through, we fall back to the inner defenses. No one runs, no one surrenders. The recruits nodded, some with fear in their eyes, others with determination. Kalari clenched her fists. She had trained for weeks, pushing herself harder than ever before. But this was different. This was real. The first attack came like a storm. Explosions shook the ground as rebel ships fired down at the camp. Dust and debris filled the air. Kalari could barely see as she ducked behind a barrier. The enemy soldiers landed, their black armor glinting under the fading sunlight. They moved fast, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Her own people. But they weren't here to save her. They were here to kill her. Kalari's capture. She fought as best as she could, dodging energy blasts, staying low like Doran had taught her. But the rebels were faster and stronger. Before she could react, a powerful hand grabbed her arm, yanking her backward. Found her, a voice growled. Kalari struggled, kicking and twisting, but the rebel warrior was too strong. In seconds, her hands were bound, and she was dragged away. Doran turned just in time to see her being taken. His expression darkened. Not on my watch. With practiced precision, he shot down 2 rebels and charged after them. But they were already retreating, moving toward their landing ships. Kalari was thrown onto a transport vessel, the door shutting before she could escape. The ship lifted off, rising into the darkening sky. For the first time in weeks, fear filled her chest. Inside the rebel ship, Kalari sat on the cold metal floor, her hands still bound. The ship hummed around her, its engines pushing them into orbit. A tall warrior stood before her, his red eyes filled with disgust. Pathetic, he spat. The king's daughter, trained by humans. Do you even call yourself Saltari anymore? Kalari glared up at him, but she said nothing. The warrior crouched down, grabbing her chin roughly. You are an insult to our people. You were weak before, and now you live among the weakest species in the galaxy. Her blood boiled. She had heard these words all her life. But now, something was different. Before, she would have believed them. Now, she knew the truth. Doran had shown her that strength was not just about power. It was about endurance, skill, and intelligence. Kalari's expression remained calm. You think strength is just about who punches the hardest, she said, her voice steady. Then you've already lost. The warrior's grip tightened for a moment before he scoffed and released her. You are still nothing. Kalari narrowed her eyes. Then why are you so afraid of me? The warrior stiffened, but before he could answer, the ship suddenly shook violently. Alarms blared. The red warning lights flashed across the walls. Then the comm system crackled. Enemy ship approaching. Human vessel inbound. Doran's rescue. Doran had never left a soldier behind, and he wasn't about to start now. Piloting a stolen solitary fighter, he chased after the rebel transport, weaving through the debris field left by the initial attack. Inside, Kaleri could hear the chaos as the rebels scrambled to prepare for combat. She knew this was her chance. She had two options: sit there and wait to be rescued. Fight. Her decision was instant. Using the moment of distraction, Kaleri twisted her bound hands and slammed her knee into the warrior's side. He stumbled back just enough for her to grab a discarded weapon from the floor. With a sharp movement, she freed herself. She wasn't just some princess waiting to be saved anymore. She was a warrior in training. The doors to the control room burst open as she entered, taking down two guards before they could react. She saw the pilot, her hands moving fast over the controls. Kaleri didn't hesitate. She slammed her fist into the controls, disabling the autopilot. The ship lurched, sending rebels flying. And then the sound of metal tearing filled the air as Doran's ship latched onto the transport. Within seconds, the hatch exploded open, and Doran stormed in, weapon raised. Kaleri stood in the middle of the chaos, a weapon in her hand, breathing hard. Their eyes met. Doran smirked. "Looks like you didn't need much rescuing after all." Kaleri grinned. "Took you long enough." A warrior's first fight. By the time they landed back at the human camp, Kaleri was different. She had faced her own people. She had fought back. She had made a choice: to stand, to fight, to win. Doran clapped a hand on her shoulder. "That was your first real battle." Kaleri nodded. She had won. But she wasn't done yet. She was just getting started. Kaleri had never felt pain like this before. Her body ached, her muscles screamed, and every breath she took felt like fire in her lungs. The sun on Rathos 5 was merciless, beating down on her as she pushed forward. Sweat dripped from her brow, her arms trembling as she tried to lift herself off the ground for yet another push-up. "You're too slow." Doran's voice cut through the noise of the training ground. His eyes, sharp and observant, were locked onto her every movement. Again. Kaleri gritted her teeth. She wanted to rest, wanted to collapse and disappear from the humiliating stares of the human soldiers around her. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking violently. One more. Just one more. She collapsed after the 10th push-up, her breathing ragged. The other recruits, standing nearby, muttered among themselves. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. "She won't last," one said. "She's too weak," another added. Kaleri closed her eyes, trying to ignore them. She had spent her whole life hearing those words. But something was different now. Before, she would have believed them. Now, she felt something else. A flicker of anger, of defiance. She looked up at Doran. Again. For the first time since training began, Doran smiled. The reality of training. The next few days were brutal. Doran did not treat Kaleri like a princess. She was expected to train just like the other recruits. No special treatment, no shortcuts. The morning started with long-distance runs across the rough, rocky terrain of Rathos 5. The first time, Kaleri barely made it halfway before collapsing. By the third day, she finished, even if she came in last. Afternoons were spent on combat drills, sparring against human soldiers who were faster, stronger, and more experienced than she was. At first, she lost every fight. But she was learning. She watched the way the humans moved. Unlike the solitary, who relied on brute force and strength, humans were adaptive, quick, and unpredictable. Doran taught her the most important lesson of war. Victory isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to strike. Kaleri started to observe, to think, to plan. And then, one day, she finally landed her first hit on a human opponent. It wasn't much. A single well-timed dodge followed by a strike. But it was enough to make Doran nod in approval. "Good," he said. "Now do it again." Breaking old habits. Kaleri quickly realized that solitary traditions meant nothing here. Back home, she had always been told that a warrior's strength was in their blood, that if you were born weak, you would always be weak. But humans were different. Humans trained, fought, and adapted. They didn't rely on genetics or natural strength. They worked for everything. She saw soldiers who weren't the biggest or the strongest still winning fights through skill and intelligence. She saw soldiers who struggled just like her, yet never gave up. And she began to change. She stopped thinking of herself as a weak princess. She stopped making excuses. She fought. She failed. She learned. And slowly, she improved. The mock battle. One evening, after weeks of grueling training, Doran called for a mock battle. It was a simple scenario. 2 teams would fight in a controlled environment. The goal was to capture the other team's flag. Kaylari's heart pounded as she stood with her team, looking at her opponents. She saw the familiar smirks from some of the soldiers who had mocked her since she arrived. They still didn't believe in her. The signal was given, and the fight began. Kaylari moved with her team, staying low, watching the battlefield. She had no illusions about winning in a direct fight. She was still not as strong as the others. But she was faster, smarter. She remembered Doran's lessons. Victory isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to strike. She stayed back, studying the movements of the enemy. And then she saw it, an opening. One of the enemy fighters had left their flank exposed. Kaylari moved. She darted through the battlefield, avoiding fights, using speed and stealth. And then she grabbed the flag. The other team didn't see her until it was too late. By the time they realized what had happened, Kaylari was already halfway back to her side. Cheers erupted from her teammates. Doran gave a single nod. Well done. Kaylari stood there, breathless, her hands clutching the flag. For the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Pride. The turning point. That night, Kaylari sat by the training grounds, staring at the stars above. She had changed. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a warrior in training, and for the first time in her life, she believed that she could be more than what her people had labeled her. She wasn't weak. Not anymore. She clenched her fists, determination burning in her chest. She would prove everyone wrong. This was only the beginning. The air inside the human training camp was heavy with tension. The attack by the solitary rebels had shaken everyone, but Kaylari was the most affected. She sat outside the barracks, staring at the distant horizon, her hands still feeling the weight of the weapon she had used in battle. She had fought, escaped, and survived. But the words of the rebels still echoed in her mind. You are weak. Kaylari clenched her fists. Not anymore. Doran walked up beside her, arms crossed. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. You did well out there. Kaylari looked up, surprised. Compliments were rare from him. I made mistakes, she admitted. Doran smirked. Everyone does. The difference is that you learned from them, and that's what makes a warrior. She turned away, her mind still troubled. Doran sighed. You're thinking about what they said, aren't you? That you don't belong. Kaylari didn't answer. Doran knelt in front of her, his blue eyes sharp. Listen to me. Strength isn't about where you come from. It's about what you do. You proved yourself in that battle. Now, prove to yourself that you can become more. She met his gaze and nodded. She wasn't going to doubt herself anymore. Training beyond limits. The next morning, Kaylari pushed herself harder than ever. Doran wasn't gentle. If she wanted to be stronger, she had to earn it. Her training became even more brutal. She ran longer distances. The dry heat of Rathos 5 burned her skin, but she refused to stop. She lifted heavier weights. Her arms ached, but she pushed through the pain. She practiced combat for hours. Her strikes became sharper, her movements more precise. She lost count of how many times she fell. She staggered, stumbled, and failed, but she always got back up. The other soldiers noticed. The ones who once mocked her now watched in silence. Some even began to respect her determination. One evening, after a particularly grueling sparring match, Kaleri stood before Doran, breathing hard, sweat dripping from her brow. "Again," she said. Doran chuckled. "You're starting to sound like me." A lesson in strategy. Physical strength wasn't enough. Doran wanted her to think like a human warrior. One night, he sat her down in front of a holographic battlefield. "War isn't just about fighting," he said. "It's about thinking ahead." He placed 2 figures on the board. "This is you, and this is your enemy. How do you win?" Kaleri stared at the board, thinking. In solitary battles, the answer was always the same. Attack first, attack fast, attack strong. But humans fought differently. She moved her piece differently, positioning it at an angle. "I wait. I let them make the first move." Doran smiled. "Now you're learning." He changed the scenario. "Your enemy is bigger, stronger, and faster. What do you do?" Kaleri thought again. "I use the environment. I lead them into a trap." Doran nodded. "Exactly. That's how humans win. Not by brute strength, but by knowing when to strike." It was a lesson she would never forget. The first real test. A few days later, Doran arranged a surprise drill for the recruits. 2 teams. A mission scenario. Kaleri's team was defending a supply base, while the other team, led by Lieutenant Garrick, was attacking. Garrick was a seasoned soldier, fast, skilled, and highly trained. No one expected Kaleri to win. But Kaleri wasn't the same person anymore. The battle began, and Garrick's team launched a direct assault. But Kaleri didn't meet them head-on. Instead, she used the strategy Doran had taught her. She had her team fall back and lure Garrick's forces into a trap, narrow corridors where their numbers meant nothing. Then she led the counterattack. She moved faster, smarter, using her size and speed to slip through defenses, striking at the right moment. By the time the drill ended, Kaleri's team had won. Even Garrick was impressed. "Not bad, princess," he said, shaking his head. Doran stood nearby, arms crossed, a rare smile on his face. "You see, you're not weak. You never were." Kaleri felt something new inside her. Not just strength, confidence. She had changed. She wasn't just training anymore. She was becoming a warrior. The king's regret. News of Kaleri's progress reached King Vorzal. When he heard that his daughter had not only survived but thrived among humans, he was stunned. The nobles in his court whispered among themselves, "She is stronger than we thought." The king remained silent. Had he made a mistake? But he didn't have time to dwell on it. A new threat was rising, something far deadlier than the rebels. And soon, Kaleri would be tested in a way she never expected. The throne room of the solitary empire was silent. King Vorzal sat on his massive throne, his golden eyes scanning the reports in his hands. The words on the page troubled him. His daughter, Kaleri, the one he had cast away, was no longer weak. She had trained under humans, fought beside them, and had won battles. The very warriors who once mocked her now spoke her name with respect. The nobles in the room murmured among themselves. "She is stronger than we thought," one said. "Perhaps we underestimated her," another added. Vorzal remained silent, his fingers tightening on the report. Had he made a mistake? Before he could answer that question, a guard rushed into the chamber. "My king, a message from the front lines. The Draskari fleet is approaching." The murmurs stopped. The entire room went still. The Draskari, a warlike alien race feared across the galaxy, had finally declared war. And this time, the solitary empire was not prepared. A call for help. Back on Rathos 5, Kaleri was finishing another round of training when the base alarms blared. Doran immediately rushed to the command center, Kaleri following close behind. The holographic screen in front of them displayed dozens of Draskari warships, moving straight toward Saltari territory. Doran frowned. "Looks like your father's empire is in trouble." Kaleri studied the screen, her jaw tightening. The Draskari were known for their brutality and overwhelming force. If they attacked, they would destroy everything in their path. Then, a message flashed on the screen. From King Vorzel to Commander Doran Kane, Human Military. It was a request for help. Kaleri felt a strange mix of emotions. The same father who had abandoned her, humiliated her, and sent her away, now sought help from the very humans he had once considered weak. Doran glanced at Kaleri. "What do you want to do?" She hesitated only for a moment before answering. "We help them." Doran smirked. "I thought you'd say that." The mission. Within hours, human warships were mobilized. The plan was simple. Intercept the Draskari fleet before they reached Saltari space. Weaken their forces, forcing them to retreat. Show the Saltari the humans were not as weak as they thought. Kaleri suited up with the other soldiers. She had trained for this. Now it was time to fight. Doran stood beside her, checking his rifle. "Remember, war isn't just about fighting. Stay sharp. Think ahead." Kaleri nodded. This was more than just a battle. This was her chance to prove herself, to her people, to her father, and to herself. The battle begins. The human fleet reached the battlefield first. The Draskari ships were massive, dark, and filled with deadly weapons. As soon as they arrived, the first shots were fired. Kaleri was on one of the strike teams, deployed to infiltrate the enemy ships and disable their weapons from the inside. She landed with her squad, moving swiftly through the metallic corridors of the Draskari warship. This was different from training. This was real combat. Draskari warriors, towering and armored, stormed toward them. The battle was intense. Kaleri dodged, struck, and moved with precision. She wasn't the same weak princess anymore. She fought like a warrior. Her movements were sharp, controlled. She outmaneuvered her enemies, using strategy instead of brute strength. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. A dangerous gamble. As the battle raged, Kaleri and her team reached the ship's reactor room. This was their chance. If they could disable the reactor, the ship would be forced to retreat. But then, an ambush. A group of Draskari elites blocked their exit. Kaleri's team was outnumbered. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Could she really do this? Then she remembered Doran's words. War isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to strike. She took a deep breath, studying the enemy's movements. Then she saw it, a weak spot in their defense. Kaleri acted instantly, leading her team in a bold counterattack. They moved fast, striking from unexpected angles. And in the end, they won. The reactor was disabled, and the Draskari ship began to retreat. The aftermath. Back on the human base, the Saltari King's official message arrived. The Saltari Empire thanks the human forces for their aid in battle. We acknowledge your strength. Kaleri read the words, but she didn't feel pride. She wanted more than just acknowledgement. She wanted change. Doran noticed her expression. You did what your father never expected. You became something greater. Kaleri looked at him, then at the stars. This battle was over. But her fight for her place in the galaxy had just begun. The battle against the Draskari fleet was over. But the tension had not faded. The Saltari Empire had been saved, and humans had proven their strength. But for Kaleri, this was only the beginning. She stood on the deck of the human warship, staring out at the stars. The battle had changed her. She had fought. She had won. But something still felt unfinished. Behind her, Doran Kane stepped forward, his arms crossed. You're thinking too much again, he said with a smirk. Kaleri sighed. I just don't know what comes next. Doran leaned against the metal railing. You proved yourself in battle. You showed your people that you are not weak. That should be enough. She turned to him, her expression serious. But it's not enough. They don't just need to see that I am strong. They need to see that humans and Saltari together are stronger. Doran studied her for a moment before nodding. Then prove it. Kaleri frowned. How? Doran smirked. We challenge them. Directly. Her eyes widened. You want me to fight one of my own people? Doran shrugged. You think they'll listen to words alone? No. They only respect power. Show them that the girl they threw away is stronger than their best warriors. Kaleri hesitated, then slowly nodded. This was her ultimate test. The challenge. It didn't take long for the message to be sent. Kaleri had challenged a Exaltari warrior to single combat, a formal battle in front of both Saltari and human leaders. The Exaltari king received the news with a grim expression. She is no longer a child, he admitted. She is one of them now. His advisors murmured among themselves. Some still doubted Kaleri. Others saw her as a threat. But one thing was certain. Her challenge could not be ignored. The warriors' arena. The fight was arranged on a neutral battleground, a large stone arena built centuries ago for Saltari warriors to prove themselves. The stands were filled with Saltari nobles, human soldiers, and military commanders. Everyone had come to watch. Kaleri stood at the center, dressed in light battle armor, her twin daggers strapped to her sides. Across from her stood General Rathok, one of the strongest Saltari warriors alive. He was taller, heavier, and had never lost a duel. The audience whispered as they looked at Kaleri. Could a former weak princess stand against a legend? The arena master raised his arm. The challenge is accepted. The fight begins. Now. The fight. Rathok moved first. Fast. He swung his massive blade, aiming to end the fight quickly. Kaleri dodged, barely escaping the deadly strike. She had expected this. Saltari warriors relied on brute strength. But she was faster. She ducked, rolled, and struck back with her daggers. But Rathok blocked her attack easily, pushing her back with pure force. The crowd roared, expecting an easy victory for the general. Kaleri wiped sweat from her forehead. She couldn't win with strength alone. She had to be smarter. She remembered Doran's words. Victory isn't about power. It's about knowing when to strike. She watched Rathok carefully. He was strong, but he was also predictable. His attacks were massive, but they left him open. She waited. The next time he swung, she sidestepped at the last second and struck. Her dagger sliced across his arm, drawing the first blood of the match. The crowd gasped. Rathok growled and came at her harder, faster. But Kaleri kept dodging. She used the environment, staying light on her feet, making him tire himself out. The battle continued, and soon Rathok began to slow. And then, Kaleri saw her moment. With a final, well-timed move, she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, her dagger was at his throat. The arena fell silent. The warriors' victory. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Rathok let out a breath and nodded. You have won, Princess Kaleri, he said loud enough for all to hear. You are no longer weak. The Saltari nobles watched in stunned silence. Even King Vorzel stood, staring at his daughter. Doran, standing in the human section, grinned. That's my student. The arena master raised his arm. Victory belongs to Kaleri of the humans, and the Saltari. The crowd erupted in cheers. She had done it. She had proven herself. But as she stood there, breathing hard, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. This was about the future, and she wasn't finished yet. The Saltari arena still echoed with the sounds of the battle. The crowd had cheered Kaleri's victory, but now, a strange silence filled the space. Kaleri stood tall, her dagger still gripped tightly. The massive warrior, General Rathok, had fallen, and even he had acknowledged her strength. Across the stands, King Vorzol watched his daughter with an unreadable expression. He had sent her away, believing she would never be strong. And yet here she was stronger than he ever imagined. Kaleri took a deep breath, lowering her weapon. She wasn't here to humiliate her people. She was here to change them. She turned to face the audience, lifting her voice so that everyone could hear. Strength is not just power. Strength is knowing when to fight and when to stand together. Her words echoed through the arena. The Exile warriors, once skeptical of her, now looked at her with respect. Even the human commanders stood with pride. Then, King Vorzol rose from his throne. His voice was deep, carrying across the arena. "You have proven yourself, Kaleri." He stepped forward, his golden eyes studying her. "You were weak once, but you are weak no longer. You have shown the Exile what we failed to see. That strength is more than just force. It is intelligence. It is resilience. And it is the ability to change." Kaleri felt a knot in her chest. This was the closest thing to recognition she had ever received from her father. But it wasn't enough. She took a step forward. "If you truly believe that, then prove it. Let the Exile fight beside humans, not against them." A ripple of shock passed through the audience. The idea of an alliance, true cooperation, was unheard of. The king's eyes narrowed. "You would have us follow humans." Kaleri stood firm. "Not follow. Learn from. Grow with. Be more than just warriors. We can be greater together." The silence stretched. This was her real battle. A new alliance. The discussion continued in the royal hall, where human and saltary leaders gathered. King Vorzol was silent for a long time before speaking. "The Saltari have always fought alone. It is our way. But perhaps our way has made us blind." Kaleri clenched her fists, waiting for his decision. Finally, the king turned to Doran. "Commander Kane, your people have proven their strength. If you wish for an alliance, then we will listen." A murmur of shock spread through the Saltari nobles. But the king raised a hand, silencing them. "We will not abandon our traditions, but Kaleri is right. Strength is more than battle. We will stand beside the humans when war comes again." Kaleri exhaled, realizing what had just happened. She had done it. For the first time in history, Zaltari warriors and humans would fight as one. Doran smirked. "Well, princess, looks like you got what you wanted." She turned to him, smiling. "Not a princess anymore." Doran nodded. "No. Now, you're a warrior." The future of a warrior. Days later, Kaleri stood at the edge of the human military base on Rathos 5. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the desert. In the distance, human and Saltari soldiers trained together, a sight that had once been impossible. Doran walked up beside her. "So, what's next for you?" Kaleri looked at the soldiers, at the unity she had fought for. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know one thing. I'm not going back to the old ways. I will fight for this alliance, for a new future." Doran chuckled. "Then I guess we're both just getting started." Kaleri smiled. She had once been cast aside, given away like a worthless prize. But now she stood on her own. Not as a princess, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a warrior of two worlds. And this was only the beginning.